the support of organizations and their missions and visions. Cheryl has joined sport law since 2021 now.
Yeah.
And with that, she brings a wealth of knowledge and executive leadership with experience in areas of strategic and operational planning and implementation, governance, stakeholder engagement, which is huge and important, and managing change. So please join me in welcoming Cheryl.
We're an organization that's been around for just over 30 years now, and we have probably about 15 consultants now. It kind of goes up and down a little bit. From the East Coast all the way to the West, I'm the farthest one in the West, in Alberta. And we have a legal arm and a leadership arm to the work that we do. And we work exclusively with sport organizations across the country at the national level, so the national sport organizations, provincial sport organizations, and then groups like yourselves, clubs that are implementing sport at the local level. And so basically what I tell people is anything that you might need from a sport organization perspective, we generally have someone within our team that can support that. So on the legal side, we have a team of lawyers that does a lot of work around contract negotiations, arbitration, dispute, anything that you might need a lawyer for. I know hopefully you'll never get to that place, but every now and then it occurs for us. And then on the leadership side, we do a lot of work, and that's where I sit. Around governance and strategic planning, HR solutions, financial solutions, coaching, executive coaching, so communication strategies, although I think you have your expert here on communications and Jeff that was just up here. So so anything you kind of need from a sport organization, we generally have someone that can support the work that we do. But when Jill reached out to me, she really wanted to focus today really on kind of the basic building blocks of what a strong a sport organization would have in place. And that's really kind of my area where I tend to thrive and love to support groups in. And so that's what we're going to focus on. And I know it's kind of spread out over 2 kind of sessions. And I'm happy to be a little flexible with you as well, too. I have some information that I would love to be able to share with you, but I also want to adapt to your needs. And I think with the experience I bring, there's probably other areas we can dip into, and you'll see that as we go through. But we'll maybe start the first hour a little bit more structured. And then after lunch, I'm happy to kind of adapt a little bit. Like I said, I do have some things, but I'm happy to adapt to where you guys would love to go. So one of the things we're recognizing within the sport world now, having been in it for I guess well over a decade now, even though I started outside of the sport piece, is what we're learning and what we're seeing across the country is a lot of the pieces that got us to where we are now might not get us where we need to go next, right? So when I think of when I started, even at Swim Alberta, we weren't dealing with the level of magnitude we are with some of the safe sport stuff. Like policies were in place, but that has increased. We're seeing a real kind of professionalization around sport where groups are actually having to really consider some of the financial pieces, the legal pieces, right? It's sometimes really hard on the back of volunteers to run sometimes some of these complicated organizations we have, and the expectations and the accountabilities levels have changed as well too, right? And you see that especially at that provincial and national level where their funding bodies, I know as clubs, you're not funded in the same way, have really said, we want a higher level of accountability in some of what you're doing, right? So we've seen a big shift in that. So, part of what we're learning is what got us to where we were might not be able to take us where we need to go, right? And so how do we put in systems and processes and really things that make us a strong and effective organization so we can navigate through some of this stuff, but also be able to focus on what we want to do, which is, in your case, deliver pickleball, right? To all the participants that you have involved in your programs, right? And sometimes we get distracted from that because of the other expectations that come with us. So the other quote I like to use is this one that came from Built to Last, Jim Collins. And I like this, and it applies, I think, more than just to employees. It says, people have a fundamental need for guiding values and a sense of purpose that give their life and work meaning more than any time in the past, and I do believe this is true. Employees, and I would put in there volunteers as well, right? Those people that are connected to our organizations will demand that the organizations that they're working for stand for something, right? So they're actually looking for that shared vision, that sense of purpose, that you have good systems and processes in place. I'm curious, just from your perspective, because I know you probably bring a wealth of knowledge even from outside the world of pickleball and being involved in different not-for-profits, whether they're, sport, recreation, or maybe service types groups. Have you seen that shift? Have you seen shifts in the expectations of people? And what are some of those shifts that you've experienced?
I've noticed as an employer of people, just a compensation package needs to include more than just a dollar amount. There has to be some sort of like life value to it, whether it's flex time or better benefits or, a willingness to let them wear a certain outfit every day or whatever it might be. And so recognizing as executive or as a person responsible for other people's happiness, sometimes you just need to be creative. You might not recognize what it is that's going to make someone have loyalty to you. Absolutely. And it might not just be a traditional compensation situation.
Absolutely, yeah. And what I might offer too, because you spoke very well there around sort of employees connected, but as member organizations or participant-led organizations where you have people coming to you because they want to be involved in your organization for what you're providing, they too may be looking for some of that flexibility and connection in different ways than what we've traditionally programmed and offered things in the past. The beauty about pickleball, I think, is you guys are so fairly new, really you are, that we really have more of a blank slate, I think, to create the future that you want. Even though you have some systems and structures in place, not entrenched like some of the long-standing sports in the country. And to me, that's just like a beautiful thing. Yeah.
You see a lot of companies now that they are offering programs, social programs, whether that's volunteerism, environmental sustainability. I work for a very large software company, and they do family grants. They're doing, you get a day off a year to go do impact in.
Absolutely, yeah. That corporate social responsibility has been around for a long time. And on the flip side of that, sometimes in the not-for-profit world, we can be the beneficiaries of that as well too, depending on the program. So I'll go to one more point here and then
our club was, we're having trouble getting volunteers.
Yeah.
So it was thrown out, well, let's charge everybody an extra $20, and if you volunteer, you get the money back. But, if they're coming kicking and screaming, that's not really the way you want them to get out there.
Yeah.
This tells me that you want to create an environment that they want to stand for something.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And what we know, because I spent years kind of on the voluntary side of things as well too before I moved into sport, but worked in the Canada Volunteerism Initiative and Volunteer Calgary when it was Volunteer Calgary years ago. We know that people generally come to an organization because they either are asked to be involved through volunteer or they believe in what you're trying to do, in this case they want to play pickleball, right? But they'll stay because they feel a sense of connection and a sense of connection to the purpose that you're creating. So I think that's a real fundamental piece. So let's take a look at what are some of the components of effective sport organizations. And I'll share, I used a version of this. This is sport lawified. But I used a version of this probably 15 years ago, slightly different, but some of the same elements. When I actually came into a little tiny not-for-profit, I was going in, it was like, oh, my first chance to be an ED. This is a nice little organization. I'm going to go in, get my experience, move out. And when I got in there, I discovered, oh, this is not quite what we thought it was. The programs aren't as wide as we thought they were. There's this big map on the wall when I got in there and showing pins where all the programs were across the city. And what I found out shortly, about 3 or 4 months after, is that the pins really didn't represent what was going on. So I actually had to take my board at that time through a sort of a sustainability review, and I used these elements of these key concepts so that we had a way to determine if that organization was sustainable for the future. So these really are elements of what we see as effective sport organizations, or any organization really in the not-for-profit. So the first one centers around having the right governance model in place to achieve your strategic goals or your strategic plan. And governance models, although there are some basic and some leading practices, and we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning, they can vary a little bit from organization to organization based on the people you have, whether you have employees engaged with you part-time, full-time, that type of thing. So it's making sure that that governance piece is in place well. And what I would offer is that the early stages of your organization, it's a lot easier to get that in place than later on. I've worked with groups that have tried to change things such as membership categories or voting structures, and when they've been around for 30, 40 years, their members don't want to do that, right? So you have a chance really to set some of those formation things, and we'll talk a little bit about. The second element is around having strategic and financial plans in place that are approved, monitored, shared, right, outwards, and updated on a regular basis, right? So, and I would say tied into that strategic and financial plan, probably not so much for the type of organizations that you're connected in your local clubs, is also if you have employees, that HR plan is very, very much tied into that. And if you want to dive into that a little bit, I have high-level financial piece. I'm not a financial expert, but we can certainly explore a little bit more around the strategic piece. The other element is making sure that you've developed the means to communicate strategically to your key stakeholders, so your members, your participants, facility providers, right? Probably some of the pieces that maybe Jeff shared this morning a little bit around marketing and communication would tie into some of those elements. Having updated policies that meet both the legal and ethical expectations of where we're at right now. So 20 years ago, I don't think any sport organizations thought of necessarily having a safe sport policy in place, right? Or sometimes maybe even a code of conduct. But we're seeing now that that's an expectation that people are looking for, and we have both a moral and a legal obligation to make sure those things are in place to protect the people that we're serving. Have an integrated risk management into all the decision making that you do, right? So there's risks that come with any organization where we sit on as a board of directors that we're leading. And guess what? I'm assuming you're all board of directors, right? All members of a board of your local club, any staff? You're all one? Yeah. So guess what? The buck stops with you guys as directors of your organizations. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those pieces if you want this afternoon. And I'll talk a little bit about your legal duties as a director this morning as well too. And then the final piece is just around that culture and having a sort of a sense of shared vision and values for the organization, right? So how do we make sure we're rowing our boat all in the same direction? That's somewhat tied into that strategic piece. But if you create a club at your local level, say you're in a large city, and you decide as a club, we really want to have a focus on recreational programming. We want to be a club that anyone can come to and play and be involved with. They can have social connections, meet friends, right? And that's the sort of where you've carved out. So you've created that. Tied into that would be your values, your culture, your strategic kind of vision for where you want to go. And then maybe you have people that become involved in your club and they're like, you know what? Like, we have a chance to make this an Olympic level sport down the way. And we want to be a club that's really competitive. And we don't care so much about the folks that just want to learn, but we want to be competitively driven, right? And so then that then shifts. But by having that sense of shared values, you can determine what direction you want to go. And neither is right or wrong. We need both. And sometimes clubs need to have that real recreational focus, that they've got a niche that they're serving, that we want them to serve. And sometimes as the sport's evolving, we need to see that competitive piece come alongside as well too, right? But can you imagine if you're in a club where you have both pieces and there's a real dichotomy happening in the clashing that can come along? So it's making sure we have that set of values. Are you experiencing that right now? In small communities, it would be hard, right?
We should build all rules and we
Yeah. And it's finding ways, maybe exploring ways in the future as the sport evolves as well too. And the challenge also in small communities, we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about governance as well too. We don't really want 3 pickleball clubs in like Leduc, right? Because you begin to then compete with each other. You got 3 boards of directors, 3 financial statements. Like there's a lot of duplication that goes on. And so how do you carve that out to meet the needs of the community? So yeah, and I can see in a small community for sure, City of Calgary, City of Edmonton, there may be value in having, 2 or 3 clubs, right? Yeah. For sure. So that's an important piece as well too. There's governance. There's governance and then what we often call good governance. And so governance really is the processes and systems we put in place that allow us to manage and operate our organizations. So slightly different than that, good governance, right, is making sure we have the right structures and processes and policies in place to manage our organizations, right? A lot of times I find what happens from a governance perspective, very well-meaning, we all come with a little bit of experience from organizations we've been connected with before, and we bring that into maybe, say, your pickleball club. It could be good governance, or it could be just stuff that we've done and we're not sure why we do it. It's kind of practices that we've done. And so how do we evolve into making sure that we've got the right structures in place? And we'll talk a little bit about that this morning. So good governance actually starts with incorporation. So it actually starts, I think I missed a slide here. There it is. I'm like, something jumped ahead here. With incorporate, I'm assuming you are all incorporated as pickleball clubs, but you might not be. And there's no judgment here because we all start in a real informal way. Is there anyone here that is not incorporated? Okay, so we might have some. That is not uncommon, but I would say it's becoming less common as we look at kind of that risk management piece, right? So the benefits of incorporating, and in Alberta, it's typically the Alberta Societies Act that we use to incorporate under, right? There is an arm in the Companies Act, not for profit, but there's more rules and regulations with that. Most groups find it easy to connect under the Societies Act. I should also ask, is there any lawyers in the room? I just ask because sometimes they have some good pieces to add. Yeah, because I'm not a lawyer, so I know this stuff well, but I don't know it like a lawyer would. So why do we want to incorporate, right? We may have run our organization kind of kitchen table that's working well, right? So we've got 3 or 4 people that have come together. We've got now 25 players. Like, it's working. Why would we want to go through the hassle of incorporation? So I would say the first thing is that it provides an identity separate from others or from the founders in the organization. So you actually go through with your name, you get a legal name. No one else can take that name. So when you become the Leduc Pickleball Club, you are the Leduc Pickleball Club when you're incorporated. And I can't come along and say, I'm going to build a different Leduc Pickleball Club and name my club that and start it. So it gives you that piece, and it begins to separate from the original founders of the organization. I would say the other critical piece to why we would want to incorporate is it limits the liabilities of your founders or your directors. And that's probably one of the biggest pieces. It doesn't mean you're not responsible. You still are, and you can be held legally responsible for decisions that you make as a director. But there are ways and systems that you can put in place to limit that liability. So then the organization of the society is a legal entity unto itself, separate from the directors that may oversee it. Incorporated organizations carry on, right? So little group, round, tabletop group that have come together, as those people move on to other interests or move to different communities, right? It may die. I didn't want to say that. Win the lottery and decide they're going to go down to, some warm place to start a pickleball club. Yeah. Right? It actually allows the organization to carry on. It also gives you the ability to formalize some of your rules as well, too. And we'll talk about that. And by rules, I don't necessarily mean rules of the court, which it can, but it gives you that ability to create the structure around the governance, how we're going to vote, who our members are going to be, who our registrants are going to be, how we're going to handle complaints, what are our expectations of members and participants, that type of thing. And then it also gives you the potential to access funding that you might not be able to get as an individual. So the downside of incorporating is, yes, there's a little bit more paperwork to do for sure. You have to file taxes, right? There's some of that paperwork pieces to do. But I would say the benefits of incorporating probably far exceed not. And it's interesting because as I work with sport groups across the province and country, many times we come into situations where they're not incorporated. Certain sports, and I'm not sensing it here, actually have it just hasn't been something that they've traditionally done, right? And so an individual may be responsible for running a club. So they may be the head coach, like the named person running it, but they're doing it as an individual. And so what we're finding now is lots of groups that are coming to us mostly at that provincial level to say, how do we help these groups become incorporated so that we're reducing the liability? Because there's also liability at the provincial level too for groups that they affiliate with that might not be incorporated. So that's why we would look at incorporation. So in Alberta, as I had mentioned, we use the Societies Act. And it's actually set up so it works pretty easy for us to do and to change bylaws within it. These are kind of the main components. This is where we begin to regulate our rules, right? When we talk about the rules, because we're able to define what is the composition of our board. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what's leading practice, how people become a director on your board. It'll define categories of membership. And I do want to spend a little bit of time diving into that because, again, that first slide where we talked about what got us here is not going to take us into the future. We've had some learnings in the last few years, especially around complaints in safe sport, around members versus participants versus registrants. It outlines the meetings of your members, so how your members come together. And in Alberta, there's really two ways, through your annual general meeting and through special meetings that the members or the board can call, right? You're probably familiar with those. It outlines the meetings of the directors, how they'll meet, how often, who calls the meeting, right? Those types of things, right? It speaks to the election of directors. And I'll talk a little bit too around leading practices, around nominations and, how we look to get people onto boards of directors. And it will outline the voting structure for the organization as well too. And as I mentioned when I kind of first started, when I said, you guys really have the benefit of being kind of at the infancy of where you are, even if you've had a club in your community for several years, you can likely begin to change these and make sure you've got good governance in place because it starts here with your bylaws. That I know for sure 25 years from now, you are going to have a really hard time changing your voting structure if you need to do it. So oftentimes in sport, they'll use a weighted vote, right? And then groups will get to the point where this is no longer working. So by weighted vote, they'll say, and it's more so at the provincial level, right? Where they'll say clubs with X amount of members get 3 votes. If you're under so many members, you get 2 votes, like that type of thing. But sometimes that becomes problematic as well too. The other piece that we need to be aware of in Alberta, and I don't know if any of you have, does Pickleball Alberta have a gaming license? Would they have one yet? They do. Okay, so by being member clubs, you can also apply. That's how sport works. The provincial body needs to be have a gaming license before clubs do. But gaming also has stipulations as well too. It's kind of 1 member, 1 vote, right? So you just need to be aware of that as well too. But it's much easier now to put those formations and those strong pieces in place.
So what all does gaming cover?
So that would be casinos. So if you're running a casino, raffles, and bingos. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's mostly the raffles. I think their rules are a little more lenient. It's more the casinos and the bingos where they're really looking. And my personal opinion is it's a real old-fashioned charity model. That's just my personal opinion. It's almost like they're trying to keep groups, I don't want to say poor, but they put in so many rules it becomes sometimes hard for them. So for example, they have a list of things that you can fund, but they don't understand sometimes that what we do sometimes to keep the organization running, we have to fund other things to keep the programs running, right? So it is a bit of an archaic model, but it's what we have. And how gaming licenses work in Alberta is that provincial body needs to be in place first. So you couldn't just as a pickleball club go out and apply. They're looking to make sure that you're connected to your that the provincial body is there. They don't necessarily need to have a gaming license. So in Alberta, we didn't have a gaming license, but they would come to us to make sure that as clubs were looking for one, that they were actually affiliated with us or were members of us. So that's just their structure, I think, to try to kind of track the sport organizations. But like a little bit of a deeper dive, because again, we have that ability to really create bylaws that work for us well into the future. You know, when you hear the word members and then registrants or participants, like what comes up for you guys when we hear the word members? What do you think of? Like what comes to mind? Players?
Yeah, part of it.
Being part of an organization. Pay a fee. Okay.
You have a voice?
You have a voice. Anything else? What about as a registrant or a participant? When you think of those, what do you think of? What comes up for you?
Tournament.
Tournament. Okay, so we don't know.
Pay for play.
Pay for play. Okay. So what I would offer, there are kind of two distinct pieces to members and participants and registrants. And whether we use the word registrant or participant, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, right? What we have found through sport law over the last several years is we've worked with groups and some of their policies and what's required from a safe sport piece is distinguishing between members and participants or registrants. I'm going to call them registrants for the sake here, but you can interchange, has become a critical piece. And so members are always defined in our bylaws. The Societies Act of Alberta actually indicates that you need to define who your members are, what their privileges are, and what their voting rights are. So members in that way have more of a statutory authority as outlined in that act. Okay, so very, very different. Then when we look at registrants or participants, their rights with you are more contractual in nature. They may or may not be defined in your bylaws, right? My guess is at the club level, in most cases, unless you're a super large club or have evolved in a different way, your members and your participants are probably going to be the same people. But as you move up the sports system into the provincial and the national level, that may change. So what are some of the rights or authority of members? And I think you use that language of having a voice. Really from that statutory authority piece, and this sometimes is where clubs and sport organizations think there's more involved in it than this. Members have 3 pieces of authority. That's all they have statutorily. They have the ability to elect the directors of the association that they're members to. They have the ability to approve the auditors or appoint the auditors for that association. And they have the ability to change the bylaws or vote on any change to the bylaws, which Jill just kind of talked to you about. Those are their 3 sort of authority pieces that they have. As directors, I fully understand that you were elected to represent that large stakeholder group of the group that you're serving, right? And so you bring that around the table. But those are the 3 legal authorities that members have, right? So sometimes you go to like an AGM and you'll see where they go into a lot more detail, right? Where members are approving budgets. They don't have the statutory authority to do that. Maybe a practice that you do. I wouldn't say it's a good governance practice, but it may be something that you do. They could be approving other things. Really, when you get to that AGM, you're looking for them to elect the directors, a motion to approve the auditors, and any motions around the bylaws. And you'll see like adoption of minutes and approval of minutes, that type of thing. That's the authority. An important piece because the organization wouldn't exist without it. As registrants, they have the ability to participate in the sport and agree to abide by all the rules and regulations that you set. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about legal duties of a director as well too. So that would be the difference between your members and your registrants. So like I said, at the local level, It's likely the same, but what happens when we look at the sort of the Canadian sport context? What happens there? So what I can tell, I'm going to go from the top down, if that's okay. So if we look internationally, is there an international pickleball yet? There might not be, and only because usually those international bodies exist around our Olympic sports. Okay, so, but someday very much could be. So typically if a sport is involved at that level, they'll have an international body. Members of that international body are the individual countries. Okay? When we get to the national level, so what we would refer to as national sport organizations, you sometimes hear the language NSO, right? Their members, generally and typically and in good practice, are the provinces and the territories. Then when you get down to that provincial level, right, and we'll often refer to them as PSOs or PTSOs, provincial territorial sport organizations, what's in good practice, what is good governance, what we typically see is their members are the local clubs that have agreed to affiliate with them. They may have registrants, which are the individual players, as well the national body, but they're actual members that have this statutory authority and those rights are the local clubs. And I think that's really the kind of the structure you want, because the individuals are then members of the club, right? So that's where that comes in.
In our sport system, we also have our national body, which shares members with us, being the individuals. And I haven't been in this position very long, it's since my first year, but I can tell you that it creates a lot of conflict and confusion, and I've mapped out what our actual system looks like, and it is a place steady. Because nobody knows that nice streamlined system that Cheryl just described doesn't exist within pickleball. I tell you, hopefully our national body is also looking at their governance so that our members, but I just wanted to say that so that you understand the environment that
they're truly trying to figure it out. And I think it's because it came on as really this infancy sport. I don't think anyone anticipated it would grow in numbers like it has. It's such a great mass participation sport at this stage, right? And so it probably made sense that there was a national body, and I know they're trying to get connected and recognized by Sport Canada, right? And so then they would get funding that way. So, and I share this because as we talked about, you really kind of are in the infancy for getting all of this right, even if it's not how it's outlined for you right now. And what you ideally want to do is build the right governance structure and the right base now so that you're sustainable long into the future as a sport.
Yeah, so if you had something like bring a friend to pickleball day, would you consider that person a registrant? They're obviously not a member. And what are the implications for insurance for them?
So do you carry insurance for your clubs as Pickleball Alberta?
I do have access.
Yeah.
Through a national program.
Pickleball Canada, right?
Yeah,
Goes
okay.
there.
So what I would say there is that it depends on what's outlined within that insurance policy or program. So, and I don't know if Jill can answer that question or if she would have to go.
The two webinars, education and all that insurance.
Yeah, so,
Coming when?
yeah.
One's on the 19th and the other one will. Actually, we might just do them all in one so that if there's a lawyer question or an insurance question.
It's
So
usually
we can
best.
see what is defined in all of that.
Yeah, yeah,
So put the 19th in your calendar.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
We'll probably be sending out information.
yeah,
And it'll be virtual.
Yeah.
So you can log in.
yeah. Because I would, and again, it's probably what would be defined within your membership policies as a club, and it should tie into your insurance. So I can give you my example from swimming when I was leaving swimming. Anyone that was coming to come try was only insured for a period of time. So there was a 2-week period where our insurance company said, during this period, we'll call it tryouts, and they can come and they can participate and they'll be covered. But if they're not registered by X date, then they won't. And so part of that the whole general liability that sport organizations carry, which again is really unique because not a lot of other organizations have it set up that way where either your national body or your provincial body is carrying general liability. And they have to have that in place because they're sanctioning your events and activities. And so they ultimately could be responsible if there was like legal implications to that, right? So that's why I would say you really need to find out what's in the policy of your insurance provider. And it could vary, because I even know like in swimming, some of the provinces had insurance, some were done by the national body. It was a mix because we didn't have the foundation, all right, from 100 years ago when it was established. But it could vary by province to province as well too, right? If they had different policies. So that's why those are really important questions. So great that Jill has got that course. I don't know about courts, right? But I know pools, same thing. We had to make sure that we actually provided certificates of insurance to all the pool facilities and co-named them. We were required to co-name them as a provincial body. So yeah, so great questions for you to ask, and it could vary by the area of the province that you're in, and great that you've got an insurance one coming up to answer some of those. I'm not an insurance expert, but and great that it's combined with the legal, because sometimes I think that's a really smart way to do that. Any other questions on the members' registrants before we move on? Okay. Can you give me a 5-minute warning too? Would you mind? Yeah. So let's dive a little bit more into governance. I like to use this phrase on the right hand or left hand side, I guess, depending on how you're sitting, standing, to kind of give an overview of what governance is for groups, because I try to do it in a simplistic way. And I would say in the most simplistic way I can describe it to you, it has two main roles. Your board has two main roles. The first role is to look after the organization, and we'll talk about the different modes and ways that you do that and some of your legal duties. And then the second role it has is to look after itself. What I often find is groups forget about that second piece. And what I mean by that second piece is looking after yourself as a board, is that if you don't have some of the good pieces and practices in place around board, like education, evaluation, recruitment, all those solid pieces, right? It becomes really hard for you to look after the organization. Then you start getting people on the board that may have a different vested interest. And I'm not talking about blocking people from coming on the board, but I'm talking about making sure that you have those right systems in place for the board. There's pieces for that as well too, right? Educating yourself like you're doing today, right? Evaluating yourself. How are we bringing people on? Are we going to an AGM and whoever doesn't, or whoever raises their head becomes the president? Might not be, as we're learning around legal implications, that might be the best approach to it, right? So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's 3 modes of what I would call governing, and I'm going to try to simplify these as well too. There's the fiduciary, the strategic, and the generative. My guess is at the local club level, you're going to spend the bulk of your time in the top 2, and that's okay. So when I look at that fiduciary, it's really the key areas of work that you're doing are really a lot of stuff around compliance and operational oversight. So it's exactly the questions we were just asking around insurance, right? Do we have policies in place, right? How do we access those policies? Do we have a budget in place? Has the budget been approved, right? How are we reviewing our financial statements, right? So in that role, when you've got your fiduciary hat on as a board member, you're really trying to make sure that you got all the legal and the fiscal accountability pieces done. If you're a registered society, you have to have financial statements that go before the members, whether they're audited by 2 people or through a formal audit, right? So it's that role. And so what some of this looks like when you're in this role as a board, likely using a lot of report-driven meetings, right? So you're actually reviewing financial statements. So a financial statement is a version of a report. You're probably looking at preventing or focusing on risks, similar to some of the questions that we just asked, and there's likely more risks, and we can talk more about risks this afternoon if you want. And you're really the questions that you're normally asking when you're in this state of operating as a board is, can we afford it? What's wrong? Is the budget balanced? Like, it's all of those, kind of like the role of the police, right? And so when you're in this mode of operating as a board, your decisions are generally made through resolutions, right? Vote to approve the 2024-25 operating budget for XYZ Club. All in favor? Any opposed, right? So you're actually doing resolutions to approve it when you're in that fiduciary role, right? You know, vote to approve XYZ director and officers liability policy, right? So it's those types of pieces, okay? And none of these are right or wrong, they all go on, right? So that next piece is more that strategic. So this is creating the path to get to where you want with the vision. Remember, we talked about having shared values, that strategic plan, the financial plan in place. This is where, as a board, you're shaping some of that strategy and maybe reviewing performance. Like, we want to grow our membership. How are we going to do that? How are we going to make it attractive? I know Jeff's probably talked to you a little bit about that this morning, right? You know, do we have a strategic plan in place? How do we know that we're operating to where the members are seeking us to do, right? And so when we're in this mode, we're usually looking to get things done. We'll often strike a committee. So we'll maybe put together a strategic planning committee to help us with our strategic plan. Right? We're asking questions such as how will we grow? How will we diversify? It's more the how questions. And in this way, decisions are often made through consensus, right? So you're not so much voting on the approval of the strategic plan, although you'll likely get there, but as a board, you're building it together and coming to consensus to what that is. So that's probably where, as a club, you're spending the bulk of your time. And these are just the governance functions. I'm not talking about any of the operational pieces that you may be doing, because I know you don't have staff in place, right? The next one is more generative, and I would say you probably find you don't spend a lot of time here, but this is kind of the role of the dreamer, right? Or the sense maker. This is where you're trying to look at some of that creative work. So maybe you've decided that you want to grow, but you recognize we're not going to have sufficient pickleball courts in our community. And who do we partner with? Typically, we think of the city. Are there other partners that we can partner with to build this, right? So you're kind of dreaming and you're looking to the future. And so in this way, you're kind of looking at what are the new ideas. You're being very critical and kind of analytical. You're asking kind of the why questions, right? Why are we doing this? Where do we need to go? Kind of the dreamer type questions, right? Likely striking an ad hoc committee to do some of this work. So, we'll take a look at it, put this committee in place or group for 6, 12, 18 months, but it's not a standing committee of the board, right? And in this way, decisions are often made, and maybe you never even get to a decision. You're kind of grappling and grasping, right? So you're just really in that dreaming mode. My guess is you don't often get here, and that's okay, based on how you're operating as a board. So here's the different types of boards that we see typically. There's kind of, we group them into 3, but I put them on a continuum because they really do fall on a continuum. So the first up here is this, what I call a full governance board. Some people refer to it as a policy board. Have you heard the policy board? But when you think of policy and what we just talked about, a board does more than policy, right? So the policy term comes out of the old Carver model of governance. So you have that full governance board, you have a management board, and then on the far end, kind of a working board. And you can be anywhere in between on this line, right? Your big organizations that employ staff, full-time staff, executive director, CEO, and staff are in that full governance mode. They should be really operating there, where they're just there doing oversight of the organization, and they're not at all involved in the management or operations. As local clubs, you probably don't have staff in place, or you might have a part-time administrator that's helping you with some things, maybe down the road, maybe that's one of your growth areas. My guess, most of you are on that working board, right? Where not only are you looking after the governance functions of the organization, but you're doing some of the operation pieces as well. And that management board kind of fits in between, right? And what I often tell groups is that management board can look different for different organizations. So Sport Club A could have a management board, and Sport Club B could have a management board, but they're structured differently because of the skill sets. Maybe A has a staff person part-time that's doing some of the programming, and maybe B just has a financial person that's helping them with their books, right? So the roles will be different. What's really critical, regardless of what type of board you have, especially in this management and working board, is that you have your roles clearly defined so everybody knows who's doing what, so that there's no role confusion.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm a little confused in what the Societies Act and, near the board. The director, are you implying that there's a difference for that reflects in the Societies Act formation, or is it just the way it's implemented in a slight?
It's the way it's implemented. So this next slide will probably show this for you. So if you want, again, I try to make it simplistic, right? Because it's how I think it helps groups understand. If this is our organization here, the red is governance, the middle, I think it's blue, maybe black, management, and the green is operations. So your governance functions are your strategic plan. It's setting your policies. It's the oversight pieces that you're doing for the organization. Only the board can do those governance functions. They can't give it to another person to do, even a staff person to do it. They're fully responsible for the governance and oversight of that organization. The moment an organization hires a full-time staff, like an ED or a CEO, the management and operation functions become the responsibility of that staff person, right? And not the board, and the board is still focusing just on the governance. But we don't have a staff, right? And so that then goes this continuum here. So maybe we have a part-time programmer involved in our organization, and we've got someone that's doing 0.25 time helping us with our books and finances. So this, in that case, the board's probably more of a management board, because some of those management pieces around developing budgets, whatnot, could be happening still by the board, but someone is actually implementing them on your behalf, right? Someone's booking the courts, doing all of that, so they're not taking care of that, right? And then when you get to that working board, they're doing all the components of it. We actually see where we see, and it's not related to the Societies Act based on your question, but it relates more to the composition of the board.
We wear, the small ones, we all wear 3 hats, right?
Yes.
We have 3 boxes.
Of course you do. Of course, and that's not wrong. That's absolutely not wrong. Where it becomes a challenge is when you have full-time staff and the board is trying to do some of the pieces that the staff are supposed to do. So I often tell groups the best way to look at it if you have full-time staff is the board has their noses in the organization, but the fingers out. But your structures could look different for this. So if you're a full governance board, you may only have 5 to 7 directors that sit on the board, right? Very different focus. In management board, typically we see kind of that 7 to 9. Why? Because we need a few more doers on the board, even though they still have that responsibility of the governance function, right? It just kind of does the workload a little bit different. If you're sitting as a working board, you may be sitting kind of that 9 to 13 people. So that's where it becomes a little bit different and where you might evolve as an organization as you're moving through some of that. Any questions on that? That's a real quick overview, I know. But I guess what I'm trying to share is boards can look differently, but it doesn't change what you're responsible for from a governance piece and what good governance is.
Does remuneration giving it that? Or is that rated, or is it?
Within the Societies Act, you're not allowed to remunerate board members. So that's really the difference between a corporate board and a not-for-profit board. Is a corporate board. So a lot of times people think that when you're not-for-profit, you can't generate revenue. You can actually generate revenue, and you can have a sizable rainy day fund. What you can't do is pay your directors. It's the only difference, right? Where corporate boards can pay. So they can pay your expenses. So you're coming here, you have gas, maybe hotel. Your expenses, out-of-pocket expenses, can be remunerated, but you're not paid for your service. Good question. So legal duties of a director. So we talked about this already, where we come into the sport thinking, I love pickleball, I just want to give back. We get on the board and we're like, oh, I have some legal responsibilities here. You actually have legal responsibilities as a director. And there's 3 that I'll focus on today. There's a duty of diligence, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of obedience. And I'm going to share these with you in layman terms, because I'm a layman too, not a lawyer. So when you think of duty of diligence, what does that mean to you? What do you think of when you think of duty of diligence?
Accountability.
Accountability.
You're representing an organization,
Yeah.
so you've got to think of the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. You're responsible for something, right? So, and what duty of diligence says from a legal perspective is that because of that, we have to act in a way that is in good faith towards the organization, is prudent, right? That we're making exactly what you said, the best decisions and oversight on behalf of the organization and its members, right? And directors are expected to exercise the same level of care as any ordinary person would. And this can change. Is there any accountants in the room? I know we talked about lawyers. Any accountants?
retired.
You're retired. Congratulations on being retired. So, what does this mean? Would this mean anything different to you as an accountant? I'm like a certified accountant, were you a CPA or a CMA?
No, not quite that level. But,
Okay. Okay, yeah, so when they get to that CPA or CMA where they actually have a professional designation, guess what? We actually believe that they have a higher standard around some of those financial pieces than you and I who haven't had that training, right? So how we may act as directors around trying to be prudent around our financial statements, making sure everything is in place, anyone with a designation is actually raised to a slightly different level because of their professional act, right? That's why we often try to seek accountants on our boards, right? For that knowledge that they bring, yeah. Duty of loyalty. When you hear that, what do you think of when you think of duty of loyalty? This is not to use one's position as a director, so I keep moving on the poor camera girl here, to further our private interests or the interests of the organization always come first. What happens sometimes in sport organizations is that we have some implications because sometimes we can be sitting as a director on our local club and we also want to be a director on the Provincial Sport Association. And so if you look at that definition of not using one's position to influence others, who are we loyal to? The club or the provincial body? Or if we're on the provincial body and sitting on the national body, who are we loyal to? Right? So you'll see more and more as you move kind of up the sporting systems, national bodies and provincial bodies may have policies that actually state that you can't sit on the board of the national sport body if you're sitting in a role that it could potentially influence, like if you're a director of a club or director of a provincial body. And you may have heard about the Sport Governance Code. Has anybody heard about the Sport Governance Code? That's okay. It applies to national sport organizations, so it's not uncommon that you wouldn't hear of it. They've actually built into that code where they're requiring those NSOs to have a level of independence on their board as well too, to avoid some of that. So it can happen because as we're small and growing as an organization, it could be that I'm sitting on the board of the club and I'm also trying to help the provincial sport organization as it's trying to evolve as well too. And I think the important piece here is to make sure that you're declaring that conflict, and we can talk a little bit more about conflict of interest if you want later today, and you're not taking part in any discussions where you may be influencing. So maybe the provincial body is looking at how we're going to hand out, Jill's not in the room so I won't get in trouble, funds to our local clubs, right? And if you're also sitting on the local club and you could benefit from that, guess what? You're going to declare a conflict of interest around that provincial board and step away from that conversation. And I think you spoke to this already as well too. Part of that duty of loyalty is recognizing that the board itself is one entity and that regardless of how you voted as a director, you always speak with one voice. You can have the best debates around the board table, and I would encourage any board that's really functioning well will debate and discuss things in really respectful ways. That's how we learn and grow as an organization. But the minute you step out of that boardroom and onto the pickleball court, everybody is speaking with one voice around a decision. It wasn't like, well, Sally wanted to go this way, and three of us wanted to go this way, and we decided to go this way on the board. But I don't really agree with it, right? So regardless of the decision, one voice.
One thing there too, it also, as a board member, when you have that loyalty, it gives you some protection. I just feel that way because, for example, when someone says, well, I don't think we should do it this way, well, it was a board decision, and you have the board
Yeah.
decision to back you up,
Yeah.
and that's important.
Yeah. You elected us to represent, you elected us to have that proper oversight. And as an individual, we may not know all the pieces that's gone into making your decision, i.e., we called the city, we found out that players can join on the courts that aren't being used, right? So you've gone through some of that stuff in order to make your decision. So absolutely it does, right? Yeah, it can be hard, especially at the local level as we're growing, but you do have that duty of loyalty. The last one is duty of obedience. And when you think of that, what comes to mind around duty of obedience? This is where we actually have to, as directors, follow the bylaws by which we are governed by. We do not have a choice. Only the members can change the bylaws. We can take them to the membership to change. But you also have to follow other rules and regulations that impact the organization. File your taxes, submit your GST, right? Any kind of laws of the land that we have to follow. You take on that role of making sure that you do that. What's interesting though, as pickleball clubs, you often act though as your own separate private tribunal. And what I mean by that is you're still an autonomous body. You became that legal entity. And so you have the power to write rules. It can't contradict the laws of the land, but you can set rules for membership. You can set rules for code of conduct. You can set rules for tournament entry, tournament fees, membership fees, right? You have all that ability to do that as an organization. So the other piece around obedience is not just making sure that you follow your bylaws and kind of the laws of the land, but that you have a further responsibility to ensure that you're implementing any rules you set fairly and equitably across the membership as well too. So if you have a membership policy that stipulates this is how an individual becomes we'll use the word participant because we talked about that, like more a participant or registrant, right? And they need to meet these criteria. And maybe you have a waiting list. You can't take the person that's 100th on the waiting list just because they're the neighbor of the president of the club, right? You have to follow the rules.
So those changes to bylaws are being done through PM or meetings that you call if it doesn't fall, like if you need to decide something that doesn't fall during your AGM.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, so the change of a bylaws, so your bylaws will stipulate, we kind of jumped over voting a little bit, but within your bylaws, it'll state what your quorum is for your AGM. So let's use how many people need to be there. And typically, general resolutions, appointment of the auditor, approval of the minutes from the last business year require a general majority, right? So 50% plus one. In most bylaws, it could be written differently, but that's typically the norm. Really tricky. It's really 50% of quorum. It's 50% of quorum for your general resolutions. Where it gets tricky is a bylaw change is considered a special resolution. And according to the Societies Act, I believe it needs 75% of those members present, and sometimes poorly written bylaws will just say 75% of members. So that's where you want to make sure it speaks to those members present. So because it's a special resolution, it's handled differently. And because it's a special resolution, you have to give your members notice that it's coming. So I believe it's 21 days notice, and that'll be stipulated in your bylaws as well too. You circulate those changes out so that they can see them in advance of the meeting. So they're handled a little bit differently. And a special resolution is defined within the Act and generally defined within your bylaws. Good question. So let's talk about some leading practices for good governance. So we've covered a little bit of these already. So one of the first things that when we're working with groups, we talk about making sure we have a clear understanding and expectations of roles. Right? What is the role of the president? What is the role of the vice president? If we have committees on the board, what is the role of the committees? How have we defined that terms of reference for our audit and finance, for our governance committee? If we have operational committees such as tournament planning, those types of things, and we could talk a little bit more about those as well this afternoon if you want. do we have those well defined? If we have a part-time staff person that's doing some of the budgeting pieces for us, do we understand their role as compared to the treasurer's role on the board, right? So that we're not, not overlapping each other.
Where would be a good place to, or maybe somebody can suggest where you can look to see, I guess, suggestions or outlines on those roles and responsibilities? Like, I know that we've had some webinars recently.
Yeah.
And so far, it's kind of a higher level. I'd like to try to see where can I go to get, more.
Yeah, so we have them. We don't just give them out, but we have templates of role descriptions for sure. That might be something that maybe as Pickleball Alberta, again, I feel bad that Jill's not in the room, so I don't, is there another, are you guys all from the pickleball board? Okay, so that might be something where maybe they begin to pull together some of those template resources for you so that clubs aren't all creating their own, because you still should review it. There may be some tweaks that you do to it, but some of them should be pretty standard, right?
The biggest thing is I have next to no knowledge coming into a lot of with any of this stuff, so it's like, hey, I've got to learn more about it. And where do I go to make it easy? So
I'm not recreating the wheel. There's several examples that exist out there. We do have them. We have a club manual that organizations can purchase, but there are templates out there, and I would say that would be a great resource for Pickleball Alberta to coordinate.
If that would be something for later on that we can find.
Role descriptions, terms of reference, templates is what they're looking for.
So I can do all. Okay, exactly. Priorities.
Just to raise that as something that I'm interested in to find out, and if somebody can point me in the right direction, that's a big help.
So we're working on a repository.
Okay.
And so my day job, I work for curling. A lot of this stuff is already done.
Right.
Have you ever find curling in a document just for because it's all been recycled, whatever, it's a remix. Doing the same thing here, on the bunch because of it. So we'll put it all in one place for you guys and post as many webinars, because I know it's all have a document place, but it's another one to understand why you need it, the practice, and those sorts of things. So webinars, these sorts of things. Sure, hopefully you guys give us great reviews. All of that kind of stuff.
Sometimes we actually do a really good job in the not-for-profit world of documenting some of these. What we don't probably do a great job of is sharing them and making them accessible to people so that no one's recreating them.
We, from the fall anyway, we went and asked Red Deer for a lot of permission. We asked Red Deer for permission to share things. And we also have gone to St. Albert and asked. There's lots of good information on both those pickleball.
You just contacted the president or someone on the board and
said, hey, we're looking, can you do mind if we share some of this stuff? And like anything else, what the gentleman was talking this morning, we're always, copying from somebody else and just throwing a twist on it.
Absolutely.